to another episode of Bro History. It's Henry Zamota and my friend Danny Abdeljabbar. What's going on, man? How are you?
Chilling, man, as per usual. How about yourself?
Allergy season, man. It's killing me. Pollen levels are absurd. That's why I sound raspy. I always have an excuse every episode of why I sound like shit. You never notice that?
Same.
It's like, oh, I got COVID. I got a cold. Now I get allergies.
Yeah.
I always have an excuse for you, man.
Seriously.
But yeah, I guess to start this off, we can just do our normal, banter, which I think the banter can segue into the actual topic. But let's talk about the weather, man. Didn't you just have a storm in Puerto Rico?
Yeah. We just had a tropical storm grazed us. About half the island lost power for a couple days, ourselves included. It wasn't as bad as some of the other ones that we faced, and it certainly wasn't like a Maria level event because it was just tropical storm. But yeah, it's now hurricane season, so you get to deal with your allergies, and I get to deal with no power and water.
It has to be scary, man, when a hurricane, like living on that island in hurricane season, that has to be, strike fear at a different level than living in New York. Even though we both experienced bad hurricanes in New York.
Right. I mean, we both lived through Sandy, and that was pretty bad.
When I went through Sandy, where I lived was like one of the only areas in New York that like the storm didn't affect at all.
Yeah, well, you got lucky.
I got really lucky. I didn't lose power. I lost power for maybe 15 seconds, and I got it back. But everyone
I think
else,
at the time you're right next to a hospital, though, right? So
I was close to a hospital.
On that good grid.
Yeah, but yeah, man, the storm season, the hurricane season, particularly that's going to be hitting like Latin America, and it's going to be hitting Central America and the Caribbean islands is going to be really bad. That's like a projection that I'm seeing everywhere, and a lot of investors are actually starting to are preparing for that. Like they're like everyone's anticipating their Central America, like Panama and parts of Mexico and like the Dominican Republic to be completely smacked with like a really bad hurricane season. So, I mean, unfortunately, you're in the crosshairs.
Yeah, totally. I mean, Africa continues to lob over tropical waves at us. So, just kind of like a fact of life. But, every time anyone asks me about like, oh, why do you live there? There's like hurricanes. Aren't you like afraid of hurricanes? I'm like, yeah, well, of course I am. But like, also people who live in other places in the world have to deal with shit too. Like, I don't know, if you live in Buffalo in New York, like pretty regularly, you're going to get a 7-foot snowstorm, and, it's just like, if you have to measure your snowfall in like human beings, I don't want to live there either, So, you pick your poison. You've got seasonal allergies. That's not something that really affects me here. I've got hurricanes occasionally.
Yeah, but a hurricane is way different. A hurricane can destroy your house.
Yeah, like they build them good here.
A blizzard, no matter what, is not going to destroy your house, most likely.
People die in blizzards, dude.
Yeah, people do die, unfortunately, in blizzards, but most of the people who die are homeless, who are like out in the street.
Ah, man, it knocks out power. People who are like, just as sensitive and like need medical equipment, they end up dying for that. If you don't have power and you can't heat your home, then, people freeze to death in their homes. Yeah, like, of course, the homeless people die too, right? Because where the fuck do they go? But yeah, I mean, it's dangerous everywhere. And it's not just like blizzards and hurricanes. It's also like earthquakes and, floods and, extreme heat. People just straight up dying in like Arizona because it's fucking hot. It's like 110 degrees every day for a week straight, and people just straight up die.
I would think the worst thing to live next to, or the worst natural event to deal with, has to be, there's two, and they're kind of the same thing, and they both happen in a particular place. Forest fires.
Mm-hmm.
That's a force to reckon with, and then volcanoes. even
Yeah.
though we've kind of understand when volcanoes are going to erupt now, so we can plan ahead.
Yeah.
But if let's just, I mean, that's not a weather pattern. That's a
Eh,
natural event.
I
But if
kind of consider that part and parcel with it. So,
well, a volcano. Let's just say if the volcano in Yellowstone Park
oh, then we're all
erupts,
dead.
then that
We're all
would
dead.
destroy the United States. That would completely destroy, like, the heartland of the U.S. and everyone who lives in the Midwest would have to migrate to the east or west coast,
I
and
mean,
it would
yeah,
cause
but also like there's going to be a famine,
yeah.
and like it's going to kick up so much dust into the atmosphere that it's going to cool the planet. We'll get a little mini ice age. The supply chains will be crazily interrupted. Like smaller shit interrupts our global economy. That would be a massive, massive problem for literally the entire world. So like that's the most extreme situation. I think more realistically, it's like looking at places like Hawaii or there's like cities and towns in like Greenland and Iceland that are like next to volcanoes and shit, and they erupt occasionally, and it's just like, oh yeah, the volcano's erupting, we should probably leave. You know, t- I'll take a hurricane over a volcano. Like I feel like my chances are better with the hurricane.
Well, those volcanoes in like the Pacific Islands, those will the like the really big eruptions haven't happened in a long time, but
Hmm.
I think it was like Krakatoa, and there was an eruption about 100 years before Krakatoa, because Krakatoa happened in like the late 19th century,
Hmm. Well,
and
there was Mount St. Helens in the 80s, right?
yeah, there was Mount St. Helens in the 80s, which killed people. But
Hmm.
Krakatoa, man, that like if you were within like a 100-mile radius, you went deaf from the sound
Right.
of it. Like
Hmm.
you lost your hearing because the explosion was so loud.
Right.
So those are, I mean, then also in like Japan, where you had Fukushima, where an earthquake caused
Causes a
a
tsunami. Yeah.
tsunami, which I guess I don't know the exact logistics of what happened, but
Yeah. I mean,
the tsunami hit a nuclear plant, and then what
that
did the
shit
plant have a
melted down.
meltdown? Yeah, so
Yeah.
that, I mean, man, weather events can really fuck
Right.
you.
But
And
it's
then
but it's everywhere.
there was
Like
that
I
one in
don't feel like
Turkey.
anywhere's safe. How
Yeah,
about in
I
the
mean, we
Midwest where
had
they
an
have like
earthquake in New
tornadoes
York.
every year? Fuck tornadoes. That's crazy.
Well, we had an earthquake in New York a
Yeah, but a
couple
little
months
baby
ago.
one. Yeah, a little baby one.
It started shaking, and it was like the most bizarre thing in the world, because I had never really been in an earthquake before. There was one earthquake years ago,
Yeah, I
like
remember that one.
and it
Hmm.
was like a joke. Like no one felt it. We're like, we had an earthquake. Like when?
I
But
was
we
super
actually
mad because
felt
I was
this one.
driving. I was driving during that earthquake, and then I got to work, and everyone's like, "Did you feel the earthquake?" I'm like, "Fuck, no! I wanted to feel it." I was mad.
Yeah, man. Well, we had a real one, and it still wasn't too bad. It was like par for the course in a place like California.
Right.
But you would think with all these weather events that man would be able to conquer nature at this point, right? Like,
Mm.
and this segues into this show. Like, wouldn't we be able to? And this is something that Jones talks about.
Hmm.
Earthquake machines. They're building earthquake machines.
Right.
Um, what's the status on that? Let's just put it that way.
Yeah. I mean, weather modification is the topic of this show today. So obviously, there's something to talk about there, right? It is. The short version is that it's a thing. But I don't think it's like rises to the level of like Alex Jones earthquake machines, though. So
There's no. I mean, it sounds like a. I mean, I'm sure there were some weapons though in the past that we've thought of that utilize like weather patterns, right?
yeah, totally, and we'll get into a few of those in a bit for sure.
Like, didn't Trump suggest something like he could like nuke a hurricane?
Yeah, yeah, he totally did. And honestly, I kind of can see why people, like regular people might think that it's possible to just stop a hurricane by nuking it, because nukes are really strong and you're like, oh, just blow it up, right? But not only is that not like possible, it's also just like a terrible idea to try. The story behind that one is that in 2019, apparently Donald Trump floated the idea that, he could just drop the nuke in the middle of the storm, like against the eye wall and somehow disrupt the eye roll. And according to the folks in his administration, he brought it up during one of these hurricane briefings that were happening. And he was thinking that, if he could mess with the hurricane structure enough to stop it from hitting the US coast, which, I mean, no idea is a bad idea if you're just spitballing, but it was kind of a wild idea. And as you can imagine, the room reportedly went dead silent when he suggested it because, it's just one of those ideas that's both bold and just kind of way out there. And apparently the guy that was running the briefing was like, we'll look into that, sir. Like that was his only response there. And of course, Trump denies ever saying this, by the way. So, it's his word against everyone else who's reporting it. So take it with a grain of salt. But I'm pretty sure he did because it totally sounds like something he would say.
Hey, you're just brainstorming, right?
Yeah. I mean, why? I don't know why he's like denying it. I'm like, yeah, why not? All options are on the table if you're just talking, But even though it sounds crazy, this isn't the first time that someone's come up with the idea to nuke a hurricane, right? But here's the thing. Experts were super quick to point out that there's like a lot of issue with nuking a hurricane. So for starters, there's the matter of like radioactive fallout. If you drop a nuke in the storm, all that nasty radioactive shit is just going to be blown around in the storm, and that's not going to be good for literally anything, right? It's just like spreading it out even farther than it would normally go. But beyond that, meteorologists have explained that hurricanes are actually way more powerful than a nuclear bomb, which by itself is fucking scary to think about, right? So not only would dropping a nuke into a hurricane not stop the hurricane, but it would now become a radioactive hurricane, which is like nightmare fuel. It sounds like a like Sharknado or something like that.
That's what I thought was thinking of.
Yeah, nuclear hurricane coming to a theater near you. No, scientists quickly shot down the idea, obviously, and Trump's suggestion to nuke a hurricane, it taps into this much older human obsession, which is what you were asking about, our desire to control the weather. And that's what we're going to be talking about today.
So, yeah, I mean, people have always, they've done like rain dances and stuff. And they thought that weather was a blessing from a deity. Can you give me some examples, from historical examples of like people trying to influence the weather and what those practices looked like?
Right. So before we talk about any of the technology that we, have today, that there, like you said, have been ancient civilizations all over the world that, were deeply into the idea of influencing the weather. And these early attempts to control the weather were rooted in this connection to the natural world. And this is like a connection that, from our modern perspective, seems a little bit mystical, a little bit woo-woo. But, for them, it was very, spiritual. And back then, it wasn't necessarily about manipulating nature, like through science, the way that we try to do today. It was more about trying to gain the favor of these gods or these spirits that people believed held the power over the elements that, happened to them. So you pointed out one good example, the rain dance, and that's probably the most famous ancient weather modification practice that's been out there. There have been, various Native American tribes, including the Hopi and the Zuni. They performed these ceremonial dances, and these tribes lived in regions where rain was absolutely critical for their crops. So they believed that by performing these very intricate dances, that they could appeal to the gods that they believed held the keys to sending the rain their way. But the rain dance was much more than just a series of like physical movements. It was like a very spiritual act. It was a ritual, really. And it involved, really specific steps, obviously, but traditional costumes, precise timing, and all of these things put together were thought to be, like critical for, making it all succeed. It was it's like a religious experience, it was a religious ritual for them. In a similar vein, ancient China had its own rituals that were aimed at influencing the weather too. And here, people performed these ceremonies to appease the Dragon King, which is pretty badass. And this is a deity that was believed to control water and rain. And during periods of drought, the emperor or sometimes local officials would lead these ceremonies, which included offerings and prayers to the Dragon King, asking for his like mercy and asking for rain, basically. And these rituals were pretty closely tied to the belief that the emperor's like moral virtue could somehow sway the heavens and by extension the weather. And this practice kind of highlights how these ancient Chinese people viewed, their state in the world, the cosmos, and also importantly, the emperor's relationship with the divine is seen as like directly influencing the natural world. Excuse me. And we've done some episodes on Chinese history, and we've talked a lot about how the emperor is basically a god, and I like to think that these weather manipulation rituals or schemes, I can imagine that they might have backfired at certain points. If there's like a really bad drought and the emperor's like not doing his job and appeasing, the deities that make the rain, would kind of call his godliness into question, don't you think?
Yeah, it would be. It would show that you don't have like the divine right. Like you don't have that. That's why you're king, right, or you're ruler, because you have that divine right granted by some higher authority.
Mm-hmm. And it's not just obviously China and ancient America with the Native Americans. It's also in Africa. They also have had rain making rituals, and that was obviously common practice there. Their rituals involved songs and dances and sacrifices to gods that were associated with rain and fertility. For example, there's this one people in Kenya called the Kikuyu. I hope I'm saying that right. And they would offer sacrifices to their god Ngai, who was believed to live on Mount Kenya, and he was believed to also bring the rain. But it wasn't just about rain either. Greek mythology is another good example. Their gods often were depicted as having control over the weather. Zeus, specifically, the king of the gods, he was known for like throwing thunderbolts and was believed to send storms as forms of punishment for stuff or to show his displeasure. And the Greeks would offer sacrifices and perform rituals to appease Zeus and other gods, hoping to secure good weather, whether it was for crops or maybe they're, making a sacrifice to Poseidon to have a safe voyage at sea, but all these practices were deeply spiritual rather than scientific. And I think it's pretty interesting to talk about humanity's like early attempts to influence the environment, because it really shows you how long we've been interested in trying this,
Yeah, we've been trying to conquer the natural world for a long time. And the truth is that if you take on Mother Nature, Mother Nature is going to destroy you. So you have to figure out a way to work with it rather than, work against it. But I guess that's what they were going with, right? They were pleading to Mother Nature,
right? They're trying to get on their good side. Mm-hmm.
I mean, what else? What other ideas do you have? I mean, you don't really know how weather and patterns work. I mean, you probably have a basic idea if you're in the ancient world, but I mean, there's an arbitrary nature to when a forecast come or when you start to see a storm cast come. But it's all really interesting. So obviously, these ancient rituals don't work, right? So at some point, humans had to go from the point of rituals and prayers to trying to, scientifically or actually, go through the process of problem solving to manipulate the weather. When did this start happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the one of the biggest game changers didn't happen until like fairly recently. It was in the early days of the of modern weather modification. One of the big things was the invention of what's called cloud seeding. And this is a technique that's designed to make it rain or make it snow pretty much on demand, which is pretty crazy. And this idea of cloud seeding first came onto the scene in the mid 20th century, which gives you an idea for like how long it's been since we've been able to like actually attempt this and make it succeed. And the first successful cloud seeding experiments were carried out in 1946 by a guy by the name of Vincent J. Schaefer. And he was an American scientist that was working with General Electric's research laboratory. Now, Schaefer, his breakthrough happened when he figured out that if he puts dry ice into super cooled clouds, that apparently he could kickstart the formulation of these ice crystals. And once these ice crystals start to form, they start collecting water droplets and they get bigger and bigger. And eventually they get heavy enough where they just fall and they fall to the earth as rain. And it was pretty revolutionary, when you think about it, because for the first time ever, we don't have to pray to a god. We don't have to cross our fingers and hope for the best. Now we're showing that humans could directly influence a weather pattern in a way that's both controlled and predictable, not like, climate change where we burn a bunch of fossil fuels and then, oh shit, we have all these unintended consequences, right? This is like we're doing something and we have a theory about what's going to happen and then it happens. And Schaefer's work didn't stop there. He laid the groundwork for a lot of further research into weather modification. After his initial experiments with like the dry ice, a bunch of scientists start experimenting with other things like something called silver iodide, which soon becomes the go-to material for cloud seeding. Now, silver iodide works really well because it's really close looking in structure to ice crystals, which makes it really, really easy to seed clouds. Actually, even easier than the dry ice itself. And these these experiments are incredibly successful, and they got people thinking about all different ways that they could use cloud seeding, especially, and this is really important, in places where water was scarce. A really good example of cloud seeding in action is, or was in Thailand, actually still is in Thailand, and they have what's called Thailand's Royal Rainmaking Project. And this was kicked off back in 1955 by King Bhumibol Adulyadej. I'm sorry, I'm totally ruining this guy's name, but I've never heard it out loud, so I apologize.
King Boom Iboy Abdul
Bhumibol
Yadej.
Adulyadej.
It kind of sounds like your last name.
Adulyadej. Maybe that's how you say it. Anyway, in Thailand, there was a lot of severe droughts that were threatening Thai farmers and like the Thai like food chain. And these farmers were obviously heavily dependent on the rainfall for their crops. And without it, obviously their livelihoods are at risk and people go hungry. So King Bhumibol, who was apparently very well known for his interest in science and technology, he took a really hands-on approach to developing this project. And his goal was to use this brand new cloud seeding thing to bring rain and stabilize the water supply for agriculture. The project officially got going in 1969. So it took him, 14 years or so to launch it after he started it. And the first successful rainmaking attempt took place over Khao Yai National Park. And it involved sending some aircraft into the sky to release dry ice. And then later on, they started using silver iodide as well. And they threw it into the clouds to, basically coerce them into making rain. And it was like a wild, sweeping success. They ended up expanding the project, which became and today still is, a key part of Thailand's agricultural policy. And today that Royal Rainmaking Project is extremely sophisticated operation. It uses advanced meteorological, techniques to manage water resources. And it didn't just help with the immediate drought relief either. It also showed how powerful cloud seeding could be used as a tool for weather management on a national scale. Um, Cloud seeding catches on. A bunch of other countries around the world start adopting that technology, and they start doing their own similar projects to tackle different climate challenges.
Jesus, I'm trying to visualize this. So they're just flying around, and then they're. So what are they releasing out of them and from the planes exactly?
A chemical called silver iodide.
Silver iodide. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And
And
that.
basically, it mimics. It's very much like an ice crystal in terms of this, like the structure of it, like the, I don't know what the right words are here. I'm not a scientist. The microscopic structure of it, the atomic structure of it, it's very similar to an ice crystal, but it works better than an ice crystal. And then those ice crystal, these silver iodide, structures in the chemical, they attract water to it. And because they're attracting water to it, the water is normally in a vapor form, kind of like, like a vape, right? But when it gets attracted, like with condensation, like if you have a cold beer on a hot day, you see all the water that's dripping from the can. Think of that, right? And the silver iodide is like making those little droplets of water on it. And eventually they're too heavy to stay in the cloud, so they fall. And they fall as rain. And that's how it happens. So it's just like forcing the water vapor in the sky to turn into water droplets and fall onto the ground.
That's pretty awesome that someone thought of that.
Yeah,
It's
pretty crazy.
Why don't we do that everywhere?
We kind of do.
So
I mean, maybe not everywhere, but like we certainly do it in places that need it.
Well, I guess what would be the consequence of doing it at some place where it's not supposed to be done?
Consequence.
But
we'll get to the consequences later.
Speaking of consequences, so what I want to hear about is like when people started thinking like, okay, we can find a way to manipulate weather patterns. How can we manipulate weather patterns to destroy other civilizations? Like when did we start
weaponize it?
When did we start weaponizing this type of thinking, for no better word?
Yeah, I mean, well, pretty much as soon as we figured it out, right? Like, and that's kind of like the going narrative for all technology. It's if the military didn't create it, the military immediately turns around and thinks, how do we use this to kill someone? And I'm specifically talking about the U.S. government, but trust me, no government is guiltless in this endeavor.
Well, man, just think about all the, the brainstorming and ingenuity that had to go into making something like I don't know, just even something simple like a bow and arrow, man.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems.
Well, I mean, it's specifically a killing tool, so
yeah. I mean,
probably a bad example.
No, I mean killing tools. Like, think about all the thought. Like, who thought of that? The bow and arrow. Like, you can make a string and you can pull it back. I guess that seems a little bit more obvious, but like more advanced weapons that took place and that were created in like the ancient age, like the like how do you say trebuchet?
Trebuchet.
Yeah, like those are just wild inventions. There's like that guy, that Roman. I think he was Greek actually, but he was used by the Romans or sought out by the Romans. I forget his name, but he would create like death ray machines.
Yeah, so with we did an episode on this a long time ago.
Yeah, a very long time ago, to where I forgot I forgot his name, but I know like the basic kind of devices that
it was Archimedes, by the way.
And he created something where I guess they used glass to magnify the sun, the sun rays, and they would use it to light ships on fire.
Mm-hmm.
It's wild.
Yeah, and as the story goes, it burned attacking Roman ships. So apparently it worked. There was like a Mythbusters episode on it, and I think they said that it wouldn't work, but I don't know. The jury's out on this because I'm literally Googling it right now, and I'm seeing it pretty recent.
I've seen a picture of it happen, so it definitely happened. I'm seeing a reenactment that looks pretty convincing.
The trouble with that is, like, if it's not sunny, it doesn't work. You know.
Well, you just gotta. I mean, you just gotta be smart, and you gotta pick your battle conditions wisely.
Well, you don't get to pick the battle conditions, but you do get to pick the weapons that you use for the battle conditions. That's the difference.
Well, I mean, it's like the some armies are different. Like some armies or navies, they wait until there's that perfect scenario arise.
Sure.
They're not good. They don't want to do anything. They want to leave. Like the Russians are famous for doing this. Like the Russians are very like, we're not moving. We want to control like every single factor. So we're not going to move forward with this campaign until all the conditions that reduce the amount of variables are gone. Like we want this to be, we want to fight in the perfect condition. That's why they move so slow when they do everything.
Well, here's a good segue to get us back on track. If Archimedes had silver iodide and could cloud seed, he could make it so that the rain would fall outside of the battlefield so that he would have a sunny day and his death ray would work. Let's just put it that way. Yeah. I've got a very specific example of that. Remind me of that later. But so we're talking about like, how do we weaponize this stuff, this weather modification stuff? So U.S. government actually started looking into that pretty much as soon as we figured it out. And the idea hit its peak during the Vietnam War with this operation called Operation Popeye. And that was a secret military project that was basically aimed at using weather modification as a tactical advantage against enemy forces in Vietnam. And this kicked off in 1967, which is right in the middle of the conflict. The U.S. military was looking to basically get any edge it could because it wasn't doing so well. And one of the biggest challenges that they faced was the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And this trail was a crucial network of paths and roads that the North Vietnamese Army, the NVA, used to move troops and supplies through Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam. The plan behind Operation Popeye was pretty straightforward. Make it rain, like literally make it rain. The idea was to extend the monsoon season in these regions by using cloud seeding to trigger extra rainfall. So more rain would mean that the dirt roads of the Ho Chi Minh Trail would turn into these muddy, impassable mucks, and it would make it super tough for the NVA to move their supplies and their equipment and their troops around. And to make this happen, the operation used a bunch of aircraft to disperse, again, silver iodide and also lead iodide and put these particles into the clouds over Vietnam and the other areas that they wanted the rain to fall. And these chemicals acted like tiny little magnets for water droplets, which caused these super cool droplets in the clouds to freeze and then fall as rain. That operation officially started on March 20th, 1967, and it ran until July 5th, 1972. So it ran for quite a while, a little more than 5 years. And it was carried out by the 54th Weather Reconnaissance Squadron, which operated out of the Udon Thani Air Base in Thailand, which is an interesting call out, right? That's probably where they got the idea. The squadron used a bunch of different, equipment, the C-130 Hercules and the F-4C Phantoms, to fly over the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and they dropped a bunch of this stuff over that from the sky. And over the course of the operation, they did more than 2,600 cloud seeding missions. It was pretty effective, actually. They estimated that they managed to extend that monsoon season by an average of 30 to 45 days each year. So, like, the rainy season lasted a whole month longer every single year for 5 years. And you can imagine what would happen. Heavy rains caused, significant flooding, erosion along the trail, which seriously hampered the movement of North Vietnamese troops and supplies. Now, This is important because we're going to talk about flooding and cloud seeding again later. What's important about this is that they flew 2,600 cloud seeding missions. So they were dropping a shit ton of this stuff in the sky, right? Just remember that. Anyhow, while the Operation Popeye showed just how powerful this weather modification could be as a weapon, it also opened up a whole can of worms when it came to ethics and legality. Using weather modification in combat was something that the world had never seen before, and obviously that sparked a lot of debate within the US government and, of course, around the globe.
I mean, it's like I'm having trouble even believing this happened, to be completely honest. I mean,
it's a thing,
I believe
man.
it happened. I believe it happened, but it seems so nutty that
Yeah.
if I just like read some random person talking about this, I'd be like, oh, that's just some crazy person. But it seems like this is real, that they really did do this.
Yeah,
Actually,
it's a
it's
thing, man.
indisputable that they did this, so which is
The
just
thing. I mean,
wild.
people started questioning whether it was okay to mess with the environment, as a way to fight wars, and it got super heated when the details of this operation leaked to the public. So it's like in newspapers and shit, like it's a thing. It happened. And just this idea of weaponizing the weather didn't sit well with a lot of people, as you can imagine. And it faced a widespread condemnation. And this controversy basically led to the international community taking action. And in 1977, the Environmental Modification Convention, or NMOD, was drafted and adopted. And this treaty was a pretty big deal. It basically banned the use of environmental modification techniques for hostile purposes. Specifically, it prohibits any technologies or any techniques that could have widespread, long-lasting, or severe effects on the environment, including weather modification as a means of warfare. So that put the kibosh on using cloud seeding for weapons.
So, were there other? So, what other significant projects were there related to like weather modification?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. Around the same time as Operation Popeye, the U.S. government wasn't just focusing on using weather modification just to, fuck up the Vietnamese. They were also looking into how they could use it to weaken hurricanes, which, sounds pretty interesting for me specifically. So they came up with this other project. It was called Project Storm Fury. And it was a research program that kicked off in 1962. And the goal of this was to reduce the strength of hurricanes by using cloud seeding with silver iodide. The basic idea behind this was pretty interesting. Hurricanes themselves, the energy that they get is coming from the energy that's released when water vapor condenses into rain. I'm not going to be able to really fully explain that to you because I'm not qualified to talk about it, but just trust me on this one. I literally copy and pasted this from the article that I read. So this word for word, what they said. Energy is coming from when the water condenses from water vapor into rain. And this is especially true around the eye wall, or the inner ring of, thunderstorms that circle the middle of the hurricane. And so these scientists that were working on Storm Fury, they thought that they could use cloud seeding in the outer rain bands, not the inner ones, but the outer rain bands, with silver iodide, so that they can artificially trigger the formation of a new eye wall. And that this secondary eye wall would compete with the original eye wall and maybe weaken it over time.
So, wouldn't that just make a bigger double hurricane?
I mean, yeah, it sounds like that, right? But actually, at first, the plan looked pretty promising, at least according to the scientists. And they ran several experiments on a bunch of hurricanes off the coast of Florida and in the Caribbean. And there were some early signs that the cloud seeding might actually be working. But as the project continued, they ran into a bunch of hurdles. One of the biggest challenges was that the scientific basis for the project, it started to come into question. Researchers started figuring out that a lot of the hurricanes that they were targeting, they already had a lot of what's called ice nuclei in the clouds. And the silver iodide is basically trying to act like an ice nuclei to condense rain, right? And all this means that adding more silver iodide to the hurricane really didn't make much of a difference because there was a shit ton of it in the storm in the first place. On top of that, the results that they were getting out of it were inconsistent. Sometimes the seeding seemed to work, and other times it didn't really have any effect at all. There was some practical issues too, which I'm sure you can imagine. You know, the idea of flying an airplane into the heart of a powerful hurricane is just incredibly dangerous, and it's super difficult to coordinate. So after about 20 years of trying to make it work, Project Storm Fury was officially shut down in 1983. And, you know, its inability to produce these consistent results, as well as, you know, getting a better understanding of how hurricanes actually function, it basically leads scientists to figure out, like, hey, this isn't going to work, right? We can't actually use cloud seeding to stop a hurricane or even slow it down. But while the idea of taming hurricanes sounded pretty good in theory, in practice, it just turned out to be super complicated, which is also why nuking a hurricane, you know, is why we know that you can nuke a hurricane through this Project Storm Fury. They learned a lot about how hurricanes work.
Yeah, well, it sounds like most of this like weather modification is about managing resources, you know, in places where they have droughts and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
What are some examples or, you know, specific examples of how, you know, cloud seeding has been used to address, you know, water, like real water shortages?
Yeah. I think if you look at it today, the you know, when it comes to cloud seeding, China is definitely leading the pack. They've been at it for decades, and given the country's just enormous size and super diverse climate, it's obvious that they'd be interested in using cloud seeding and weather modification in general. It's particularly important in China's northern arid regions where they have a lot of water scarcity, and it's a really big issue for them. But one of the more famous example of China using cloud seeding happened during the 2008 Beijing Olympics. I don't know if you heard about this one, but the Chinese government really didn't want it to rain on their parade. like literally. They didn't want to ruin the opening and closing ceremonies. So they basically rolled out a massive weather modification program for the Beijing Olympics. And they fired thousands of rockets and artillery shells that were filled with silver iodide into the clouds in the areas surrounding Beijing, like around it. And the idea was to make it rain before the clouds can get over the city. And it worked, right? So, you know, here's the Archimedes callback. If Archimedes had cloud seeding, he could cloud seed around the fortress that had his death ray so that the clouds would drop out of the sky before they get over his death ray and ruin his death ray. But that's what the Chinese did. And they forced the rain to fall outside of the city limits, and it kept the skies clear for all of those events. And it honestly, it just showed how advanced China's capabilities had become, and also just how far along we've gotten with weather modification. But, you know, obviously China's cloud seeding doesn't stop there. They've continued to invest heavily in that technology, especially in places like northern China. And they're even looking at expanding cloud seeding efforts across the Tibetan Plateau to boost the water supply for the Yangtze River, which we've also talked about on this show, which is dwindling, and it's a super vital resource for literally millions of people. So that's one really big example. We talked about how the U.S. basically invented cloud seeding in the 40s, and
Yeah, I was going to
today,
ask you that.
yeah,
Like, it sounds like most of these advancements are made in
in
Asia.
Asia. Well,
So
no, it's all over the place. So let's talk about the U.S. for a bit, right? Today, it's super important in Western U.S. where there's a lot of water scarcity, right? One of the most well-known applications of cloud seeding in the U.S. is in California, Colorado, and Wyoming. And these states, they use cloud seeding to basically increase snowfall in the mountainous regions because it's crucial to create a lot more snowpack because that snowpack is a major water source. because when it melts in the spring and summer, that's the water that they get in their water table, right? So basically, they do this cloud seeding in the mountain areas, make sure that it snows a lot during the winter seasons, make sure they get a lot of water on hand for the rest of the spring and summer. And this exercise is super important for the Colorado River Basin. So everywhere that is in that area, because that supplies water to millions of people across 7 states. In Nevada, they have this thing called the Desert Research Institute, and they run one of the longest standing cloud seeding programs in the country. Their focus is on the same thing, boosting snowfall, except this time in the Sierra Nevada mountains for pretty much the exact same reasons that I mentioned before. More snowfall, more snowpack, more water later on. And they use a mix of ground-based generators and also aircraft to shoot silver iodide into winter storm clouds, and it's been shown to increase the snowpack by as much as 10%. So that's really fascinating, and it's especially useful for climate change because pretty much every year the Earth is getting warmer and warmer, and it snows less and less. So it's very fascinating. So we talked about Asia. We talked about the U.S. here.
How about the Middle East? You would think they would be really prevalent in like the Middle East.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's like basically a desert. The United Arab Emirates is a really good example of this. Actually, they've been basically using and having to deal with their country's chronic water scarcity forever. They are basically a desert, so finding ways to increase rainfall is crucial for obviously their rapidly growing population and their economy. So the UAE, they have a cloud seeding program too, and that started in the late 90s. And since then, it's evolved to be honestly one of the most sophisticated operations in the world. And they regularly send out aircraft that are equipped with these flares that disperse what is called hygroscopic particles. Don't ask me what that is, but stuff like sodium chloride into these convective clouds, and these particles, they work super similar to a lot of the things that I've been talking about already. They help raindrops form more easily.
Is this what turns frogs gay?
We'll get to that. Hold that thought. And so UAE, they're typically focused on summer months when there's a lot more of these convectional storms, and also it's fucking hot during the summer, so they really want to just get some rain out. Recently, they really ramped up their cloud seeding efforts under the National Center of Meteorology's Rain Enhancement Program. And it doesn't just cover operational missions. It also includes a shit ton of research and development to make cloud seeding more effective. And they're really pushing the limits on the technology, which is obviously, being spread around the world. So they're working with international experts to figure out new methods, new materials, including, and this is crazy, nanotechnology to create more efficient cloud seeding stuff, which I think is pretty interesting. And the impacts of this have been pretty significant. Reports from the UAE are even better than the stuff that comes out of the United States. Apparently, they've been able to increase their annual rainfall by up to 30% in targeted areas. And this extra rain is obviously vital in a desert, right? It replenishes groundwater and it supports their agriculture. But like any large scale weather modification effort, it comes with its own set of challenges, including a lot of unpredictable weather patterns and potential environmental side effects.
Well, earlier this year, there was a really bad rainstorm in Dubai.
Yep.
And I think some people died. Like everything was really, it was completely flooded. Because I know some people who live in Dubai, and, they were telling me how nuts crazy it was. Mm-hmm. So was this caused by, was this obviously was a consequence of, or maybe not obviously, a consequence of the cloud seeding program?
I'm glad that you brought that up. This kind of calls back to what I was talking about earlier for, Operation Popeye. I read about that too. Apparently that was the heaviest rainstorm that they had in like 75 years. And from what I've read, the actual experts on the matter say that no, cloud seeding didn't cause that specific flood, and that cloud seeding programs, as they are intended, meaning, to create additional rainfall for like human consumption, that those programs aren't likely to cause floods in general. So that cloud seeding programs like the one that the UAE have at best, they can boost existing rainfalls by 10 to 20%. UAE says 30%, but even still, that's not coming close to the levels that, they were achieving, for example, during Operation Popeye, where they're just nonstop bombarding the skies with this silver iodide stuff. Also, it's important to note that there's a ton of variables, and the reasons why are complicated, and I'm not qualified to talk about it. But basically, all of these variables are involved in, and for cloud seeding to work, it's really dependent on things like cloud temperatures, wind patterns, and a bunch of other stuff that we basically have no control over. In a place that already rains a lot, it's really easy to, make it rain a lot. In a place that it doesn't rain a lot, it's going to be a lot harder.
Well, I bet it's because they just don't have the infrastructure to deal with heavy rain.
Yeah, for sure.
It's
that's
kind of
100%.
It's kind of like when Atlanta had that snowstorm.
Yeah,
like probably a decade ago at this point, and it was like 2 inches of snow and the city shut down.
Right, they lost their goddamn minds. Yeah, you're 100% right. They don't have rain drainage infrastructure. Like they're not expecting heavy rainstorms, so they obviously don't invest in building that kind of infrastructure. That would be like Puerto Rico buying a bunch of like snow plows and salt trucks. It's just not something we expect, or that would probably really happen. So, you get one really bad rainfall in 75 years, and that's probably all you're going to have to deal with for a while, And honestly, the more probable theory as to why it rained so heavily in Dubai was probably due to climate change. And, some climate change deniers are going to roll their eyes at this, but the truth is that warmer clouds carry more water than cold clouds, and the Earth has been warming steadily for years. So there's no two ways around it. But what's important about this is that the idea that people are pointing their fingers at cloud seeding for Dubai and this flood, and saying that that's the reason why this is responsible is really one of those natural but kind of unintended consequences of development of weather modification technology.
Yeah, you really can't blame people for hearing or reading about this and being like, what the fuck is the matter with these people? Why are they trying to unnaturally cause weather patterns? It's like Mr. Burns, Mr. Burns blocking out the sun. That's didn't Bill Gates talk about that? Like,
dude, that's a thing.
Oh, that is
also
a thing? So it's not just some bullshit I read in
a... It's a thing.
I admittedly, I probably pick up too much headline stuff. You know what I mean? Because sometimes I'll just see a headline and I'll be like, oh yeah, isn't that the thing that happened, right? But you're saying that thing did happen, so what?
It's a thing that can happen, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, I thought you said it's a thing that has happened or is happening.
Is happening. Like people are developing this kind of technology too. Maybe if we have some time, we can talk about it. For sure.
Well, given that you can't really blame people for being freaked out in this, and people, posting videos of chemtrails, like, oh, I've got the chemtrails.
I mean, I totally agree that there's been a almost at the same pace as the rise of this technology, there's been a rise in conspiracy theories around it that are suggesting that these technologies are used for, like, I don't know, secret or sinister purposes. And these theories are often, they're marred in misinformation but also it's kind of like based in this general distrust of governments, which is fair, and sometimes scientific institutions, which can be fair at times. And it's become a pretty significant part of the conversation around weather modification, these conspiracy theories.
Well, I didn't realize that you could do this until we started talking about it today. I always thought it was just some like kook shit. Mm-hmm. But what are like the common conspiracy theories that surround weather modification?
Okay. Well, I think one of the most infamous examples is this conspiracy theory around the HARP, which is a U.S. research program that was originally set up to study the ionosphere, which is the layer of Earth's atmosphere that's like 60 to 600 miles above us, so like pretty much right at the edge of space. And HARP's official purpose is pretty straightforward. It's very well documented. They're just studying the ionosphere, just looking at it and measuring it. And but these conspiracy theorists have been accusing it pretty much since it started of everything from controlling the weather to triggering natural disasters like earthquakes and hurricanes and shit. And some people even claim that HARP and its powerful radio waves can manipulate weather patterns and even mess with human behavior. Like, they actually think that it's like messing with you, like specifically. But scientists have been obviously debunking these ideas for since they started and explaining that HARP's activities are obviously limited to the ionosphere and they don't impact the weather systems whatsoever. So that one's a really big one. I think it's pretty wild because I'm not really sure how radio waves can cause an earthquake, but whatever. People think up crazier shit than that. Then there's this bizarre theory that came to light when U.S. Marjorie Taylor Greene, the U.S. representative, she suggested that wildfires in California were caused by space lasers controlled by the Rothschilds, which is
The Rothschilds?
why, yeah, they that's a wild one. And obviously this claim has no, it's baseless. And it's honestly it plays into like a lot of anti-Semitic tropes, and there's no evidence to suggest that there are space lasers outside that are burning California. Um, but like a lot of these conspiracy theories, I think it reflects again the tendency to blame these complex natural events on deliberate actions of like these powerful shadow elites or whatever, even when there's no evidence to support the claim. My personal favorite, of course, is the chemtrails. I know you've been dropping this one, so here you go. And according to this theory, those condensation trails that are left by the aircraft. Most of us know them as contrails, but they've been renamed as chemtrails. So the theory goes that these are actually chemical or biological agents being spread by governments for, again, weather control or even mind control. And as Alex Jones puts it, it turns the frogs gay, which is one of my favorites from Alex Jones. um, but I can see how they think this, right? We literally do have the capability to put chemicals into the sky that change the weather, right? So there's like truth to that. But the idea that every plane that flies by is now spreading these chemical agents and turning frogs gay, that's just like a bridge too far, right? Like you've taken it in like a wild, wild direction. And there's plenty of evidence that shows that these trails that are coming from the airplanes are just water vapor. It's literally the same thing as when you go outside on a cold day and you breathe and you see all that like, vapor come out of your mouth. It's the same. That's the same thing that's happening with these airplanes. Um, and you know, the theory is still out there, despite the fact that it's very easy to show what this is. And these theories often overlap with these weather related conspiracies, and that just feeds into this broader sense of mistrusting weather modification technologies. But again, despite lacking scientific backing, it gains traction, and largely thanks to social media and the internet and fake news and shit like that, it spreads pretty like wildfire. you know um and I think it really just highlights a broader cultural skepticism towards science and government, and it's a reflection of deep rooted fears and anxiety about technology, and of course of control. Because people feel like they don't have any control, and the governments have all the control, and if they have all the control, that means they must also control the weather. you know
Well, hey, man, we used it ourselves in Vietnam to
It.
increase their rainy season by a month.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, why couldn't they do something like that again if they really wanted to?
If they
So
did, yeah, they certainly could.
all of these, um, you can't like completely discredit the mistrust of this technology because you have to
Sure.
think that it could also just be mismanaged by a bunch of idiots too, right? Like
Yeah, totally.
someone's going to inherit this, you know what I mean? And what if the people who inherit this technology are not as competent as the people before and they just they mismanage because it's like a form of centralized planning, right? When you think about it,
Yeah,
right?
totally.
Where we're manipulating the weather to what ultimately like produce, get a crop yield, right? to
Mm-hmm.
to produce an amount of substance. And obviously it has its benefits, um especially in these areas where they don't get much rainfall.
Mm-hmm.
However, there's got to be some risk, right? Like there's someone could screw something up or mismanagement or get some type of calculation wrong. And um what are the risks? And like, are there? It just from everything that we're saying, it sounds like there's not this risk of like someone making some wrong calculation and then like, oops, we accidentally caused a Category 5 hurricane, and now we're gonna lose the Caribbean forever.
Right.
It's not like something like that, but it sounds like if there was mismanagement over a long period of time, that could cause like a great amount of damage.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's pros and cons to it, and that's I kind of sit in the middle on this. In our day, we've made some pretty incredible strides in our ability to modify the weather for a lot of really good reasons. We've been talking at length about cloud seeding, and it's become a super valuable tool for increasing rainfall in drought prone areas, which obviously brings water to places that desperately need it. Countries like China and the UAE, they've been using cloud seeding with great success. It's been boosting their agricultural productivity, and it's helping them to manage their water resources, and especially in regions where like literally every drop of water counts. But yeah, it's not just about making it rain. And this is something that we didn't get too much time to talk about, but you kind of brought it up. The idea of geoengineering is also gaining traction. Um, there's technologies right now like solar radiation management, which in a nutshell is the Simpsons episode, what you're talking about, which is either partially blocking or reflecting the sun to cool down the planet. And there's like a million different ways to do that. Like you could put stuff in the clouds to make them brighter and more reflective, and then that reflects the sun and that cools the planet. And then it goes all the way to like very technological where we're sending, a solar shield somewhere between us and the sun, and it blocks out just a little percentage of the sun and just stays there and just cools us off because we're just getting a very little moderate percentage less sun rays every single day. That's a thing that we have. It's like we have the technology to do this. It's in development. Some of these things have been tried already. There's also carbon capture, which we didn't talk about either, which is basically sucking out all the bad carbon shit out of the atmosphere, the stuff that's causing the planet to warm. And there's like a million different ways to do that. We don't have time to really get into all of them, but they exist. And a lot of these new technologies offer like large scale interventions that could help us stabilize the planet's climate or make it permanently, habitable for us and the rest of the, living things on our planet. And if these technologies work as we hope they do, it could totally buy us a lot of time, as we work towards, more sustainable practices. But like you said, man, a lot of this shit comes with risk, right? I think there's a real chance that we can end up causing a lot of problems that we're trying to avoid in the first place, right? Geoengineering, as an example, that block out the sun, it could create unpredictable changes in the ecosystem, right? And in weather patterns all over the world. The weather is super finicky, and it's a really, really complicated interconnected system. And if you just fuck with some of the variables just enough, you could really spring off some pretty bad shit and create a lot of environmental challenges that we might not be ready to handle, right? Who knows, man? It's possible that we could create that Cat 5 hurricane by accident. It's just really hard to tell, right? And even if we could tell, it's going to be really hard to make the case that this one specific thing did it. It's like the butterfly effect, you know what I mean? It's a chain reaction of stuff. There's also like a lot of like cultural and societal issues that surround this question. We're making these scientific advancements. As we do, there's always going to be a number of people who are going to be so nervous about them that a lot of these conspiracy theories are bound to pop up. And even though most of these theories fall apart with just a little bit of scrutiny, I think it's important for us to like think about and talk about these deep-seated anxieties and mistrust that a lot of people feel towards technology and government. And of course there's the spiritual aspect of it, the fear of playing God with the weather. It taps into super old concerns about humans overstepping our natural boundaries in it, and that resonates with a lot of people. And in some cases, I think it's totally fair to be a little bit concerned about the technology and it potentially being weaponized in some way, because we literally did it already. It's not like, oh, what if we use this? No, we did it already, and it can happen again, and it could also happen at a much bigger scale because we got better at it. So I don't know, man. As we move forward, these ethical questions around weather modification are only going to get more important, I think.
I think there's these two sides to it. And one, if I was selling it as like a positive, I would sell it as, hey, this is like basically an extension of like the Roman irrigation system. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like
it's like
this is
more fancy.
Yeah, this is just a more sophisticated version of the Roman aqueducts. We're transporting water and resources to a place where it needs in just a more creative in a more creative way.
Right.
Because societies have been doing that forever. They've been manipulating their environment to make it more. I mean, that's how civilizations really started. It's by making, irrigation systems and being able to ultimately create surplus grains to, live through drought seasons. Now, on the other hand, it's like you're giving someone has all this power to impact these things that you just have no control over whatsoever. Like we are increasingly moving into like a lower trust society where people are very skeptical of authority, and just like this thought, like, oh yeah, they also control. Not only do they control, the military, the financial systems, they also control the weather. It's just like another thing that you don't have control of, and that's I think where it becomes unsettling. It's like, hey, what if they figure out a way to like, just, you could think of a scenario where in maybe like 100 years from now, where let's just say there's like a secession, there's a state secedes from the union or something like that, and like, hey, we don't want to bomb this state, but we do want to keep it in the union. Why don't we just cut off the rain? Like, we'll just make it so it doesn't rain in this state anymore, so all the crops die. You can see something like that.
Dude, that is literally what Iran says right now. Iran blames their low like water rainfall or their droughts on other countries, specifically Israel somehow, doing rain modification and cloud seeding. They're actually making this argument right now.
They could be right. and like it's probably not even, like a foreign policy decision to like, oh yeah, we'll just like create droughts in that country by cloud seeding, because every country in the Middle East, that's like, one of their big concerns is water scarcity.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's one of the reasons why a lot of the cultures developed the way they did, was that search for water.
Yeah.
And now you have the ability to like manage those resources at the expense of other countries or states. I think that can become a pretty complicated issue. And if
You
they're
know,
making, oh, go
but that's
ahead.
so interesting that you bring this up because you talked about like Roman aqueducts and you're talking about like our ability to manage these resources. And like this isn't particularly new. I think what's scary about this is that we're heading into new territory and people, fear the unknown. Nobody's controlled the weather ever in the history of the fucking earth until now, right? But when you think about it, an aqueduct was super small scale, take some water from one place, move it to another. But when you think about it, dams have existed for a very long time, and the mega dams that we're building now have serious implications. There's like issues on the Nile right now where like people on the lower Nile are mad at the countries further south that are in the upper Nile regions that want to create this dam to create energy for their countries. But what the dam does is it dries up the river. It makes it so that there's less water that passes through the Nile and flows down the river. So now crops in Egypt and, northern Sudan don't get enough water now. And those are places that, I mean, talk about civilization springing up around water. Like the Nile River is one of those like classical examples of a vibrant, rich society springing up around a reliable source of water. And
Yeah,
so
yeah.
it's the same idea,
The
right? You
history
don't
around
even
the
need
Aswan
cloud
Dam
seeding.
is really interesting. Like
Mm-hmm.
all the shit that they had to do to build that thing. Like there was a lot of
Mm-hmm.
there was like a lot of deal making that the Egyptians had to do to get that built. It's a pretty interesting history where, they were at first like the US was going to sponsor it, and then, the like there's a lot of Cold War politics in it. Um German engineers were the ones who were like behind the blueprint.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like a real interesting story that we may I don't think we have time to get into, but yeah, sorry for that tangent. Um complete your thought.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that like my point is that we've been fucking with the natural processes for a very long time. Weather modification, in my opinion, is not particularly new in the sense that we've been terraforming for quite a while, and I think there's serious positive that we can get out of it. But like you, I also have my level of reservation around who gets to choose, right? We have to weigh the potential benefits of technologies like cloud seeding and geoengineering against the risks of these unintended consequences. And we need to seriously consider who gets to decide how, when, and where they get used. You know?
You can see like like wedding parties. Like, hey, we got to make sure it doesn't rain on the wedding day, so let's do cloud seeding so it rains everywhere besides where the
This one
wedding
area.
venue is.
Right. But that's not sustainable. You know what I mean? That's what I'm talking about when I say deciding how, when, and where it gets used, right? You can't do that because, you're going to rain on someone else's parade that didn't have the money to pay for the cloud seeding. You know what I mean? Like I think it's okay to discuss the implications of this technology, but I think we got to be careful about giving weird or dangerous conspiracy theories like weight, because I think it seriously hampers our collective ability to use technology for good. You know, it's an interesting topic.
It just adds unneeded confusion to like what the real ethical issues are. You know what I mean? That's usually what these conspiracy theories will do. You know, like mind control agents coming from chemtrails. It's like, how does that even work? Like, what are they? What is there some type of molecule that's released in chemtrails that like goes through your nose or something?
I mean, that one I can kind of
contact.
That one I can kind of maybe see a thread there, but it's more like the ones where it's like a radio station in Alaska that's pointed at the sky is somehow creating earthquakes. Like, I don't follow the thread there. You know, like I really don't. I just truly don't.
Yeah, man, it's crazy. It's crazy stuff. It's it's exciting that, you know, we get to live in this luxury, but it's also just like AI systems, you know what I mean? Like they're making so many things so much easier, but the unintended consequences that AI systems are going to have and what they're going to do in terms of like just eliminating so many jobs. I kind of see that in a similar vein, but
yeah,
it's interesting. But like, there's like a real case study here because this is something that we've been doing for such a long time. It's interesting to see like how it will advance.
We may yet be living in a world that's like lush and perfect with no crazy.
Just everything is centrally controlled. Like every rainstorm is part of a schedule.
Perfectly planned, perfectly distributed. That's a possibility, man. It's also a possibility that, you know, a tyrant somewhere, you know, could be the US, it could be somebody else.
If an AI model decides when,
yeah, like it could be an AI model.
I mean, that's if they combine the two. An AI model it decides like when, you know, rainstorms should happen to have the perfect outcome for crop yields and like evenly distribute the right amount of rain in like every single geographic location on Earth.
Or they use cloud seeding programs with drone airplanes to basically starve the Earth of, you know, rain in the areas that we need it everywhere and kill us off as a species because we're a cancer to this planet. And also we stand in the way of AI. That's a possibility.
Yeah. Why I'm nice to my
your Alexa.
I'm not nice to my Alexa. I stopped calling her a bitch when she when she goes on randomly. All right. Is there anything else that we should cover?
No, I think we're good.
Okay. Thanks everyone for listening to another episode of Bro History. If you like the show, make sure you rate and review the podcast. It is the number one way to support our show. You can also join our Patreon. And then we have a YouTube as well where we put up clips. Is there anything else you would like to say?
Well, if you want to engage with us a little bit more directly than the reviews in your Apple podcasts, you can also write us comments on those YouTubes. I tend to respond pretty quickly. So let us know what you think. Tell us what you want us to talk about. And let us know if you think we suck. Because that's fine too.
All right. Peace, guys.
Peace.